Stamp collecting. No, not just for nerds and stereotypical grandmothers, but the quieter American pastime. Fun for the whole family as you pretend you're working towards a bonus Easter egg of life that you get if you fill out yet another scrapbook with postage markers. Almost 60 million people collect stamps, some of which can be valued over $2 million. And, fun fact, the technical term for the study of stamps and collecting them is philately. See? Learned something already. Also, there's probably some sort of stamp out there for you. The US has tons of collector stamps. Cowboys, cheeseburgers, baseball, Santa, cat in the hat, cat who likes lasagna, glorious revolution, the peach emoji, near copyright infringement, pussy money weed. We've got everything on US collector stamps. They'll even fuel your nightmares. Just look at those eyes. But why is stamp collecting even a popular hobby in the digital age? How is that still a thing? Well, oddly enough, you can partially credit the U.S. Postal Service, the agency in the center of our case study, the Postal Service, Entrepreneurship, and the challenge of combating downsizing in public administration. Before we can talk about why stamp collection is kind of philosophically controversial in this case study, we need to understand the basics of the Postal Service, its successes and shortcomings, the legislated structure of the system, and what entrepreneurship is. The Postal Service, if funded and staffed properly, is a remarkably efficient service that we've got in the US. In fact, we've got perhaps the best state postal service in the world. Not only is it statistically the cheapest and farthest reaching service, but for evidence, in 2006, 37,000 offices mobilized 700,000 workers to deliver 213 billion parcels to 146 million destinations, and its annual revenues exceed $72 billion. That's a pretty cool system. However, on the other side of the coin, the internet has thrown the USPS for a loop. Since 2006, over 5,000 branch offices have been closed due to lack of use in the United States, often rural offices that may be the only available office for a great number of rural Americans. Likewise, there were only 503,000 employees remaining in 2017, according to Statista.com. And let's face it, physical mail is not being used nearly as much anymore. The Postal Service we've all known since we were born has only been in existence since 1970, when the Postal Reorganization Act of 1970 was passed in Congress with the help of the Nixon administration. To see why, we've got to look back to spring of that year. Dateline, March 1970. Postal Service workers are on strike across the nation because the rent is too damn high, they can't feed their babies, and workers want fair wages for their labor. Likewise, a lot of the working conditions were seen as unsafe, the benefits for being a postal worker weren't appealing, and there was a big racial divide in the service. Lots of white workers left the industry after World War II for better pay, adding a racial lens to poor compensation of Postal Service workers. So, in the spirit of demonstrating for rights and wages, the strike began in New York and quickly got over 200,000 fellow strikers nationwide. Thus, mail basically stopped dead for the day, and the stock market had a temporary crash. When President Nixon tried to reprimand the workers back to their posts, more postal workers went on strike just to spite him and fuel the movement. Seeing how the strike cut into legal notices, business communication, and prevents checks getting to the government, the Nixon administration said, "Hey, whoa, okay, fine, stand down. We'll let the union negotiate wages, even though that was hitherto set by Congress. Can you go back now? The National Guard isn't good at being mail carriers." After 8 days, the strike ended and work began on the Postal Reorganization Act. See, Nixon did some things right. The new law converted the Post Office Department into an independent establishment. This conversion shifted the new USPS under the executive branch of the federal government. Remember this part, it's gonna tie a lot of this together real soon. That's the history of how we have the USPS after 1970. But what does it look like today?
Well,
At the top of the chain, we have the Postmaster General. This is the CEO who oversees the business of the Postal Service. Today, it's Megan Brennan. The Postmaster General is chosen by the 9 governing members of the Postal Service's board, who are themselves appointed by the President, who gets advice and counsel on the decisions from the U.S. Senate. And here's where it all starts to get a little complicated. Remember when I said that the Postal Service is now an arm of the executive branch of the government, but naturally Congress has to pass the Reorganization Act? Welcome to our main problem here. Because the branch is executive but independent from partisan politics, the Postal Service actually doesn't report to the President at all. In fact, it only kind of has to report to Congress, and only to deal with the Postal Rate Commission, PRC, whose job it is to set the rates the service charges us to mail stuff, make judicial decisions when the service says it needs someone to make a call, and it authorizes the service to shut down post offices that are ghost towns. Other than that, the oversight and accountability in the Postal Service is kind of hard to track, at least according to the book. Naturally, that causes more problems. 1. Nobody knows who's supposed to take oversight. If Congress barely oversees the post office and the executive branch lets the USPS do its own thing, it's tough to decide who to call on if there's a major problem the post office needs help dealing with, or if someone needs to file a grievance with the service. 2. Political pawning. It's the classic go ask your mother, go ask your father routine. Different divisions of government can conveniently pawn off responsibility for the USPS if the situation makes it convenient for them. 3. It's harder to advocate for more funding when times are tight. Though both the President and Congress have their own budgets, without cabinet representation or an entire congressional committee, it's hard for the service to publicize needs for funding or resources when things get tough. And get tough things have for the post office in recent years. Think of the last time you sent a letter. Go on, take a second. When was the last time you put a letter or card into an envelope with postage and mailed it? Not recently? And if it was, probably had been a while since you had done so last. Modern digital infrastructure has made non-packaged mail far more obsolete. Naturally, since that kind of first-class mail is what the USPS has a monopoly on, the Postal Service has really had to work to compete with FedEx and UPS, the service's main competitors. Remember that the Postal Service runs 46% of the world's card and letter mail each day, but that's not including large packages, business shipments, and other non-first-class mail we usually think of when we hear mail. The Postal Service needed to develop and market new offers, and they've got a decent track record here. In 1977, the Postal Service introduced Express Mail. The service also has 4 performance evaluations each year since 1990 to make sure that the system still operates like a well-oiled machine. Both of these innovations have demonstrably helped the service stay afloat, but it hasn't been enough to do the job, and the service knows that. If the U.S. Postal Service were to ever lose their monopoly on processing first-class mail, you can kiss the service and 503,000 jobs goodbye. And this brings us back to stamp collecting. The reviews and express options have kept the USPS in the game, but that doesn't mean they're miracles. But if they diversify, they can bolster profits, and so they turn to stamp collectors. Nerds and old people are a cash flow for the Postal Service because they know those people will buy collector stamps. These folks are often willing to pay whenever the local post office says there's 3 new ones with an owl, Milton Hershey, and a fire tire on them, and though the hobby is in decline, philately isn't dead yet. When an Elvis Presley stamp was released in 1992, this thing was as popular as Elvis Presley. Man, the Postal Service saw an unexpected boom of people wanting this stamp. Soon after the release, the service met and basically said, hey, let's do that again with another dead celebrity to make money off of people who like their memorabilia. And soon enough, Marilyn Monroe was on the next one. This is known as entrepreneurship. When an organization, public or private, for-profit or otherwise, begins operating some form of business practice to bring in revenue. Sounds good in theory, sure. Let's have collectors buy stamps at a wide profit margin to help bolster our service so everyone can be guaranteed mail service. In fact, that sounds really great. Our book notes that some peers who took the Postal Service's lead are the Chicago Public Library, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and, for some reason, the Los Angeles Coroner's Office, all of them selling swag to help make ends meet. Well, what's the problem with that, you may ask? Those entities are famous, they've got the market, and so long as the coroner isn't selling limbs and teeth, why shouldn't they? It's the principle of the matter. Sure, selling stamps as a public administrative bureaucracy helps the budget, but what happens in 20 years when automation goes full swing and suddenly another recession is underway? Who will they turn to then when they need a really big donor? It's not guaranteed, but the precedent does allow patronage in exchange for expected favors, something that arguably ought to be kept away from public services. Numerous studies have shown that entrepreneurial mindsets and objectives, especially in service systems, not businesses, can lead to corrupt business practice. When we introduce these types of behaviors and frames of mind to things like the Postal Service, the door is open to make these public administrations all the more private, which leads to some ethical concerns. Are big money interests allowed to bankroll new projects they may benefit from? Are profitable offices to begin receiving preferential treatment from upper management? And if so, who's going to take the lead on overseeing that upper management of the service? The PCR may not be equipped yet to take on the role in the greater capacity. By commodifying a public service without a clear body of oversight, the Postal Service now faces an ever-growing financial problem that will make them rely more on entrepreneurship endeavors, all while having to still cut more jobs and discontinue or suspend operations in more rural post offices, cutting off mail services to hundreds of thousands of Americans. So, in terms of public administration, we have seen how the USPS has become the establishment it has through public legislation, how its peak performance is remarkable, as well as some of the challenges it's been facing in recent years. We've discussed the pros and cons of entrepreneurship, and we hope you've been able to formulate some ideas on whether you agree or disagree with these practices coming out of a public bureaucracy. Now comes the discussion portion of the presentation. This has been an MS Paint stick figure lecturing you because Ben really didn't want to have to speak much. This video has been sponsored by Maxwell House, Franzia, and FedEx. FedEx. Hey, it was like that when we loaded it into the van.